a really quick explanation of your DWP so it can help you just a little bit more. So when you click on the DWP, you're going to notice that what your job is that you are going to take this essay prompt and you're going to create a T-chart and a thesis statement based on the essay prompt. If you go ahead and click Submit Assignment, you'll notice down at the bottom an easy way to do the T-chart. Make sure you add a couple of spaces so that you can do the rest later. But if you go back up to the top, you can go ahead and insert a T-chart and it's going to look something like this. Now remind yourself, this is going to be a causation essay. You know this because it says cause and effects. Affected is the effects. So we know this is a causation essay. So remember, what goes on the left side of your causation essay T-chart? How about causes? Then on the right, what goes on the right side of the T-chart? This is going to be effects. Now remember what is going to go in the center. PSE, political, social, economic. And if you notice, what are we going to focus on the most? Causes or effects? The correct answer is effects. So we're going to go ahead and put some stars right here because we need to make sure that we focus on that for these sections. Now what I want you to do is you're going to go ahead and brainstorm the answers to this question. Now remember, the question is how the market revolution affected the economy. So how did the market revolution impact the economy on the United States? How did it affect it? Now there's lots of different things that you could do. Remember, PSE is only a brainstorming. You could have all of them in the E, you can have all of them in the P. It's kind of up to you what you want to be able to do as you go to do your T-chart. Now the hardest one is going to be the causes. Now there's a couple of ways you have to look at this. Remember, language of the question. The question itself asks how the market revolution affected the economy. So your causes must be what caused the market revolution to affect the economy. So a lot of these could be the causes of the market revolution. If you have a specific effect, so a lot of people today, for example, did changes in transportation. A cause would be the creation of the Erie Canal. The cause could be the creation of the steamboat. The cause could be what problems that they had before they had the steamboat in the Erie Canal. Anything along those lines. Now, when you're done with that, you're going to go ahead and create your thesis statement. Now, even though it's a causation essay, I personally like to put effects at the beginning because that's my major argument. So I could do something along the lines of, although the market revolution affected the economy between blank and blank because of, insert your three stuff here, it was caused by item 1 and item 2. Or I could do the market revolution affected the economy between blank and blank due to, insert your 3 here. However, it was also caused by blank. So I basically like to do with the thesis statement that we did on the first causation essay. I just like to flip them. It's a little bit easier when you do this. So go ahead, create this, should take about 10 minutes, and go ahead and submit it. Okay, so today's DWP is just a little bit different because what we're going to try to do is we are going to try to basically do essay writing, but we are now going to be doing it in a little bit of a more unique way. So our DWPs are going to begin to switch from SAQs to practicing writing skills from our LEQs that we've been practicing over the last couple of times. Now, when you go to see this, I've given you this essay prompt. Evaluate the extent to which the market revolution affected the economy between this time period. If you notice, we've been working on causation essays, which are cause and effect, and now you're noticing that this is a causation essay, but now we're focusing on the effects rather than the causes, okay? Now, if you go ahead and select the Submit Assignment, and you can scroll back up in just a minute, but I want to be able to show you how to do this. The first thing that you're going to do is you're going to create a T-chart about this essay prompt. If you want to know how to create a T-chart in this text box, you can click the table right here and make like 2 boxes by 2 boxes. And then in the first box, remember what goes in the top left of a causation essay T-chart? Do you guys remember? Causes. Okay. So we have causes here. So what goes on the right side? Effects. And according to our essay prompt, which of these are we going to focus on for most of our essays? Effects. Okay. So I could put a little star there just to remember. Now remember, what are the letters that go down below? What's the first letter? P. What's the second letter? S. And what's the third letter? E. P-S-E. Okay. So in just a moment, you're going to brainstorm. Now with this essay, we're focusing on the effects. So what were the effects of the market revolution on the economy. Think about the inventions. Think about the ways that the economy changed or adapted based on these different inventions. On the causes side, you have to remember we're using language of the question. So in this case, what were the causes of the market revolution affecting the economy? You can do causes of the market revolution. If you want to do, for example, that you're going to do an effect of the economy on the Lowell system, you could do what was the cause of the Lowell system. Okay? Anything along those lines. You need a minimum of 3 effects and 2 causes. We're just doing this so that we can write our thesis statement. Then you're going to write your thesis statement. And remember, there's many different ways that you could do this. It kind of just depends, on your preference. So, for example, I could do the although thing. So I could do, although the market revolution affected the economy between blank and blank due to blank, blank, and blank, it was caused by blank and blank. That's example number 1. Or I could do the market revolution affected the economy, sorry, I'm not spelling right, between blank and blank because of, insert here. However, it was also caused by blank and blank. However you like to write your thesis statements. Okay? Yeah?
So will your causes be the actual inventions or the reasons behind it?
It's up to you. Because the actual inventing itself is technically the first industrial revolution, so it's really a cause. So a great example is, let's pretend you did the mechanical reaper, and you wanted to talk about how the mechanical reaper made agriculture affordable, and you could actually start to be able to make money off of it. Then your invention itself would be, the invention of the mechanical reaper would be your cause. Or the fact that farmers were only able to do, multi-crop economies because they were trying to feed the entire community. Whatever you want to be able to do. So it's how you want to write it. Yeah?
So are the causes we're talking about, are the causes of the market revolution?
So the language of the question states the market revolution affected the economy. So your causes are causes of the market revolution affecting the economy. So technically you could do the causes of the market revolution, because didn't that then lead to effects? So it's really however you want to individually write it. It's whatever you want to do. Yeah?
For format, because on the LEQ we did the 3 causes to effects.
Yeah, so now you just flip them. So now you start with effects and do 3 effects, and then you do the causes. Some people will write it the other way. The market revolution, or there were causes of the market revolution that affected the economy like blank. However, the most important thing were the effects, which were blank. I personally like to just flop them because it's easier in my head to be able to do it that way. Okay, so I want you to go ahead and spend about 10 minutes, 7 to 10 minutes, and go ahead and create your T-chart. And then go ahead and also create your thesis statement. Go ahead and get started. I just want to take the opportunity to explain to you really quickly the assignment that you guys are going to do for homework. Make sure that you get this homework assignment done as soon as possible. It really needs to be in by Wednesday and Thursday so that other students can learn about their topics from what you are going to present. So here's basically what you are going to do. Is that you are going to click on, if you go ahead and click on this reformer speed dating right here, it's going to look something like this. Now what's going to happen is in just a little bit, and I'm just about to create this, but I don't have students in the room right now, so I'm going to hurry and film this really quickly, is that I'm going to have a link to be able to see who your assigned person is. Once you have that assigned person, you can go ahead and open up the assignment and you're going to find this. So you're going to be teaching the other classmates in your class about your topic. So what you're going to do is that you are going to fill out this paper based on the person that you found. Your research should be about 20 to 30 minutes, nothing super long. You go ahead and you fill out all this information about your person, and then you are going to go ahead and, you're going to go ahead and find a primary source from the reformer and create a multiple choice question similar to the ones that you've seen in class based on the person that you have been assigned. Then this is kind of a little bit of a fun thing. You're going to have a pickup line. So for example, the person that I was going to, you didn't get this in the lecture, which is fine, that I was going to select is really good at compromising. So he basically solved a lot of the political strain because he was compromising, and so my pickup line would have been, I know you're not perfect, but I'm willing to compromise. You see, that's a compromise. I'm using that as part of it. You can use the internet. This is just supposed to be something fun. Make sure it doesn't go very risque. It should be PG or barely into the PG-13 range when it comes to the pickup lines you create. Once you're finished, and this is again for distance learning students only, if you are an in-person student, please contact me. What you're going to do is that you're going to go down here and you are going to select your distance students. Because you can't participate in the distance learning activity for next class period, this is your Wednesday assignment. So what you're going to do is you're going to click distance learning students only, and you are going to copy and paste what you've researched into this discussion board. You can see this is literally what I did. I just copied and pasted into here. All you have to do is create a brand new reply to the thread and go ahead and copy your stuff over. On Wednesday, you're going to take all these different students' information that they learned and you're going to copy it into your own notes and learn from that, but we'll do that a little bit later. So again, your homework assignment is to fill this out and copy and paste it into here, and I'll explain the rest on Wednesday.
So before we get started, by the way, I need to talk to you really quickly about an assignment that is on your guys' day by day. So I'm giving you a full week to do the quiz. So the information from today is going to be on the quiz, but I'm giving you a full week to be able to do it. So it's actually not due until November 2nd. I am sure all of you will do it probably on November 2nd, okay? But I'm giving you the opportunity to do it early. It's the same quiz that we've done in the past, so now it's just on the Market Revolution stuff. It's basically 1800 to Market Revolution, so it goes from the alligator notes to the tractor notes, and that for the most part is going to be what's on that quiz. You do need an access code for that quiz though, so I'm giving you the access code now. So if you want to write it down, put it somewhere. The access code is SPOOKY, SPOOKY, one word, all lowercase. Spooky, because it's Halloween on Saturday, and you guys all get an extra hour of sleep. Are you guys excited? Yes, because it's daylight savings. So remember, spooky, SPOOKY. If anybody asks you what was the access code, and they're not in person right now, they probably didn't watch the lectures. This is trying to get kids to watch the lectures who are distance learners. Okay, so it's spooky. All right, so no, just all lowercase. Trying to make it super simple. Just spooky. All lowercase, okay? So that quiz is available online. You have until next week to be able to do it, so it's up to you. You will not have homework on Wednesday afternoon, or nighttime, sorry. So for example, Wednesday, you want to make that as your homework day, but you won't have any homework after next class period. You will on Friday, but that's different, okay? All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started today. So we are, again, on our tractor notes, so you should be on your tractor notes that are right now. And we're going to just end and finish up the Market Revolution because we didn't really get the opportunity to do that before. So when we talk about the Market Revolution, we first have to talk about the impact of the Market Revolution on domestic versus foreign economies. This is halfway through the first page, right next to the wheel of the tractor. Okay? So part of the issue is that a lot of this Market Revolution stuff started to bring up what is our domestic policy. So our policy here inward in the United States. And we started to have this idea, if you want to highlight, of what is called internal improvements. And internal improvements are basically anything that attempts to improve the infrastructure internally. And we'll talk about this extensively as we go along in the class. Now, when we talk about what internal improvements are, if you go ahead and highlight, this is roads, bridges, canals, waterways, etc., mostly transportation. This is halfway through the first page of those notes that you have in your hand. Nope. Other side. Other side. Front side. Front side. Halfway down. Yep. Domestic versus foreign. Up. Oh. There you go. Okay, perfect. So let me give you an example. If you notice where it says right here, if you want to star the second bullet, this is an overall reason that would support internally improving our roads, canals, waterways, etc. The idea is that if we have better transportation and internal improvements, it will make trade easier and then create international trading opportunities. Now, when we talk about making our state something that would attract other people, this is part of our internal improvements. For example, if you guys notice all the construction on I-15. I-15 is under endless construction, it seems like. okay? And I live right on 90th, so I experience it every single day. So they're widening the road along I-15 between Bangerter and the 215. That's the goal. It's supposed to be done in about 3 years is the overall goal. Anybody know they actually authorized that funding? Does anybody know why they authorized that funding and where the funding is coming from? It's not just to make it faster. It is for the Olympics. So Utah is trying for the 2030. It's the 2030 bid city for the 2030 Olympics. And because of that, they used Olympic bid funding to pay for I-15 to be extended, because we have such a big population now that if the Olympics were to come here, we would need more ability to go back and forth on I-15, or we're going to get all congested. If you ever want to be really thankful for travel times to Skyline, if the Olympics come in 2030, our road times to get to Skyline are going to be crazy, because everyone's going to be going on the 215 to get to the Olympic Village up at the U. So, but luckily you guys are all be done, and you can all make fun of your siblings who are younger than you, who get to experience that hopefully in 2030. But that's the idea of internal improvements. If we internally improve I-15, travel becomes easier, and it's easier to have international stuff such as the Olympics. However, there are also some concerns about this. And some of these concerns, so this would be the alternative view of it, is that if we do this domestic manufacturing, we're going to start to switch to more foreign issues than domestic issues. And so maybe if creating all this is improving, is that possibly going to move our focus away from domestic stuff and move it to more international stuff? And that makes a lot of people really concerned. But overall, this idea of creating an internal marketplace is accepted by most, saying that it will, if you will highlight, unify the national economy and result in strengthening international trade. That is the overall hope that most people would have. Now, we talked about cotton, but we didn't get a chance to actually take the notes about the cotton, so I'm just going to kind of explain the cotton industry really quickly. Previously with cotton, there were two types of clothing. One type was wool, which is what most clothing was made out of. The problem, wool is extremely hot. Imagine a Utah summer and having to wear all your clothing with wool. Additionally, you had linen, and linen was much lighter, but the problem with linen is that it tore extremely easily, and it was so light that oftentimes it was see-through. So that was another problem. So most people had two outfits. They had a linen outfit and a wool outfit. Well, the problem is that they only had one outfit of each because they didn't have enough money to afford more than one. So imagine wearing the clothes that you have on right now for the next 6 months until it becomes summertime and you can wear your linen, and that includes underwear. Underwear is typically you have 2 to 3 pairs of underwear. Most of the time it's one single one, and you change that pair of underwear about every 8 to 9 months after it rips, and you never take it off except to shower and stuff like that. And so instead they needed a cheaper alternative, and that alternative comes with cotton. Now when we talk about cotton plantations and the expansion of cotton, obviously as we talked about previously, it's going to be due to the cotton gin. Now in terms of the major developments of cotton, if you want to start the cotton gin and black belt, and we'll talk about those, we know the cotton gin, but we'll talk about the black belt in just a second. Cotton begins to revolutionize at this time, and it's mostly due to the cotton gin. As we know, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. Do you guys remember from our Shark Tank activity what other invention he created? Thank you, Interchangeable Parts, to the Interchangeable Parts group. Okay? So, Interchangeable Parts was also created by Eli Whitney, which is the idea that we can adjust things and be able to transport things and fix things without replacing the entire object itself. Now, he creates the cotton gin. However, most people do say that he did not technically invent the cotton gin. It's more than likely he took the idea from one of his slaves. But regardless, though, he is considered the inventor, even if there's controversy. If you want to write next to the cotton gin, though, there's one tricky thing about the cotton gin, and if you want to write, it is pre-1800. The cotton gin was invented before 1800, and a lot of times if there's a market revolution essay, it starts in 1800, which means can you use the cotton gin as evidence in your essay? No, but what you can use it as what? Historical context. And that's what most people do. So most people use the cotton gin as historical context on a market revolution essay. It can't be used as evidence. You can use the effects of the cotton gin, because that really takes place 1808 and beyond. But overall, you have that. Now the cotton gin massively skyrockets the production of cotton. And cotton now becomes the main manufacturing that I would say most of your clothing is made out of cotton in some way or another. Now, below the cotton gin, I want you to go ahead and write the word effects. We are going to list the effects of the cotton gin. And these are mostly all stuff that you could use in your essay because most of the effects on the cotton gin are post 1808. And we'll talk about why it's post 1808 in just a little bit. So the number one major effect is that clothing is going to become cheaper. Clothing becomes extremely cheap, and now you're able to have more variety. You're able to have fancy colors. You're able to have some days that you wear a nice one, some days that you just wear a chill outfit, whatever it could possibly be. But the second major effect is obvious. It's the mass expansion of cotton. So the mass expansion of cotton. Now, cotton becomes the staple and it massively expands. And if you notice here, it begins to skyrocket, especially 1860 is the start of the Civil War. So you can see it was massive expansion compared to 1860, just 40 years earlier in 1820. Somebody last class asked, why is there this stall? That's because we went to war during this time period. We'll learn about that in 3 class periods, or 2 class periods, something like that. But we did have a little stop there, but for the most part, it's massively skyrocketing. The other major impact is a couple things. Number one, the South becomes a one-crop economy. Most of the South, I should say, becomes a one-crop economy, meaning their entire economy becomes solely based on the cotton industry. This creates the next effect, which is what's called the Black Belt. And those are capitalized letters. Now, the Black Belt is this deep south belt, and you can see it in the really deep red here, but you can see it a little bit easier on this map, okay? Is that the Black Belt gets created, and the Black Belt is basically where all of the cotton is produced. Why do you think there'd be one specific area where most of the cotton is produced? So this is easier for slaves. What else? Erie Canal's in New York. The land, the soil, the environment, okay, all of that made it so that this was the perfect spot. And we'll talk about later what happened with the Black Belt. But for the most part, this ends up becoming extremely condensed in terms of cotton and different things like that. Now, the other expansion we'll talk about that actually in just a second. I changed my mind. Is that when we talk about the Deep South and cotton and its relation to cotton, there's a lot of controversy when it comes to cotton. So this was something that went viral a couple of years ago. This girl was walking through Hobby Lobby, and she saw this cotton that was a decor. It was in the decor area where all the floral stuff was. And she posted this on Hobby Lobby's website or at Facebook page and basically said, why would you ever have this as decor? This is having people use this as decor at the expense of African American slaves and different things like that. Within only 3 days, there was 15,000 people who shared it, 75,000 people who reacted to it, which is like a Facebook thing, and 172,000 comments in only 3 days. And this massively went viral. People started to debate, should cotton be used as decor? Does cotton still have its relationship with slavery when we talk about the word cotton itself? Now, one person just commented and said, it's a plant. Chill. This was the top comment. Okay? They had thousands and thousands of people comment and refuted this. And a lot of people supported it as well. Should cotton be considered what we've had in the past, or is it different? To give you a little bit of perspective, cotton-themed weddings are extremely popular. If I went on Pinterest and I grabbed this, as I just searched cotton wedding decorations, and there's pages and pages and pages about using cotton in your wedding. Yeah.
My aunt did that for her wedding.
Yeah.
I have so much of it just lying around.
Yeah, it's really popular. It's really cheap. It's far cheaper than flowers. And if you notice, for example, this girl right here, she has a cotton bouquet and things like that. And this has come into question, especially since that post. Should cotton be used as decor or not? Now, in the Deep South, it is pretty common to have cotton at a wedding. There used to be this show called Four Weddings, and most of the weddings were in the South. And most of them had cotton at some point in there. Here's another question for you. Should there be weddings at plantations? So today, these plantations are these really big event centers. So they've converted a lot of these plantations to these really big events. And a lot of people in the South get married at plantations. But there's been some question again. Should you get married at a plantation or not? Is it still affiliated with it? To give you a little bit of perspective, I don't know if you guys have heard of the actors and actresses of Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds. They are married, and they got married at a plantation. And about 3 weeks ago, they went on social media and they said that they've deleted all the images from their wedding off of their social media accounts, and that they are distancing themselves from the plantation. And they said that they apologized and they're going to get remarried so that they can be considered married someplace that's not at a plantation. So it's kind of up to you if you want to think of whether or not it should or should not be. But again, cotton itself has become really synonymous with slavery, and should we use it or not? Yeah.
So, I'm guessing they just get married there for like the looks, like.
Yeah, I mean, if you Google plantation wedding, I mean, they're gorgeous now. And you can go anywhere in the South. Like when I went to New Orleans, there's several plantations nearby, and one of those plantations has a slave tour that you can go and see, like all of the places where they had been enslaved. You can go see their quarters. They have a whole like interactive thing. It's like a lot of New Orleans kids goes there for their field trips, for example. Well, that place is also an event center. So what happens is they have the slave tour, but then also they have, at the same time, they had weddings on the night that we were there. So we went and toured it. That night they had a massive wedding. They have banquets. There was a Boy Scout dinner there.
Like disrespectful?
Well, it depends on your perspective. So there's a lot of people, especially since June, that have said that the plantations and cotton itself are synonymous with slavery. So anytime that you use it as decor or whatever you use it for, you're having that be synonymous with slavery. And however, a lot of people are saying it's been 150 years since we've banned slavery. We've moved beyond that, and now it is not synonymous anymore. But it just depends. I actually saw this on TikTok the last couple of days. In the past week, for whatever reason, there's been a really big thing about cotton, and I've seen there was also a clip from the 4 weddings where there was somebody who was a black woman, and she said, "This wedding is on a plantation. I am so excited to be here." And you could tell that she's not, because she's somebody who's black who's going to a wedding where nobody was black at that wedding, and it was on a plantation. So it depends. But it is, I mean, you can look, they're gorgeous. If you've seen The Notebook, that house that it was on was a former plantation that they filmed The Notebook at. So it just depends on your perspective. But I'm not somebody who's black, so I can't make a decision of whether or not it is or is not okay, because I'm not part of that group. So anyways, controversy as we go through. By the way, in case you didn't know, there's actually a national organization for cotton. It's called Cotton Incorporated. It's like the national foundation. They provide 95% of your cotton that's made in America. They came out with a statement, and what their statement said is they said that they were surprised by this, and then they said that most people don't associate decorative choice with slavery, basically. And they said the U.S. cotton industry today bears little resemblance to that of the last century or the one before. And they talk about why modern cotton is good, and it should no longer be associated with slavery. So again, it's based on your choice of whether or not it is or is not okay. But what I can tell you is that slavery does begin to grow, and the South becomes well known for this cotton. And if you'll put as your next effect, it begins synonymous with what is called king cotton. That is capital K and capital C is king cotton. King cotton is the idea that the South becomes completely ingrained, their entire culture begins to transform and be completely associated with the importance of cotton. This is part of the reason why even up until 10 years ago, you can look up parades, like 4th of July parades, and they'd have one of the floats be of king cotton. And it'd be this big king, and he'd have cotton all around his crown. And that's this idea that the South becomes synonymous with that cotton industry and the creation of cotton in the South. Now, unfortunately, though, things begin to really take a turn for the treatment of slaves. So this is the next, and I wouldn't put it as an effect, but I would just put it somewhere in the margins, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. One of the biggest reasons all this happens, if you will put down, is the banning of the international slave trade. Banning of the international slave trade. And again, this is just in your margins, wherever you want to put it. And this is in 1808. And if you want to put in parentheses, is the Constitution. Do you guys remember when we talked about the Three-Fifths Compromise and how that adjusted the Constitution for slavery? There was a caveat in that Three-Fifths Compromise. They said, yes, we'll give you 3/5 of a person, but in 1808, the international slave trade must be banned. That was their goal. And it worked. They did ban the international slave trade. Unfortunately, what they didn't expect is that the banning of the international slave trade completely changes the American slave industry, and for a lot of it, it gets a lot worse. The reason why is that with the international slave trade banned, if you still want slaves, how are you going to get slaves in the United States?
Black market.
You're going to, well, you could get the black market, but where's that black market going to be? Inside the United States. So what happens is that the banning of the international slave trade moves from international trade to domestic trade of slaves inside of the United States. But what happens is that you also have an increase of sexual assaults, because if you can't import slaves, what can you do? Make more slaves. Because remember, with chattel slavery, if your slave has a child, that slave is also enslaved into you. And so what happens is that you begin to have this massive trade network. So if you'll also put next to the cotton gin underneath, the next effect is the creation of the domestic slave trade. And you can also put underneath it that another impact is the increase of sexual assault on slaves to create more slaves. And what happens is that slaves begin to be separated in this domestic slave trade. So if you notice right here, you can see the dad is leaving and the kid and the mom is being left behind. And even this mom and kid thing, the kids would often be sold out too. Basically, they would wait until the kid wasn't nursing anymore. And then they would trade that slave. Sometimes they would actually, there's tons of primary sources that talk about that the mom was like nursing the baby on the slave block as the baby was being sold off. And they take the baby and then they go and sell it while she was in the middle of nursing. The slave trade becomes really, really bad domestically in the United States. Also, violence begins to increase because you want to be able to intimidate your slaves into staying, and it just becomes a really bad situation for everybody involved. Or I shouldn't say everybody involved, but specifically the slaves that are involved. I don't want to misspeak. So you can see that one of the examples, by the way, of how they would start to trade people is that they would have what is known as a coffle. So what basically happened is they would take all the slaves for slave auction and they would walk them sometimes hundreds of miles to the slave block. If you notice, so this is the selling a mother from her child, so you can see that she's being separated from the husband and they're being separated apart. This would be used, so you can see where it says right here, I have often known them take away the infant from its mother's breast and keep it while they sold her, as that transition of moving apart. So what they would do is they would take these coffles, and sometimes they would also go by ships. So if you notice, these are all the ships coming in and going to the different trade centers that are specific for trading slaves as a major trading post. If you guys remember, we have the triangular trade, right? So Europe goes down to Africa, which goes back to North America, which goes back, and this transition back and forth. The major port in the United States for this triangular trade was a place called Richmond, Virginia. And Richmond, Virginia, which I went to a couple of years ago, became the major slave area and slave import as well as the slave trade domestically as time had gone on. Well, what happens is that the reason it's become so popular is because Richmond is on a port. And because it's on a port, it's able to easily transport slaves back and forth, whether it be domestically or whether it be internationally as well. And this becomes known as the major trade block. So like you would talk about the slave block, that's what it's called, which is where you would go and they would put you up on a block and then they would end up trading you and being able to sell you or whatever it could possibly be. Now, when we talk about another impact of if you want to put necessarily an impact next to the international slave trade, so if you just want to do like a little arrow from the banning of the international slave trade, it also has a major effect in that the value of slaves skyrockets. So slaves at this point become the same worth today as a car, a nice car. And the reason why is because you can't just keep importing. So if you're not able to import, the value goes extremely high because of supply and demand. Yeah.
Was it really common if you were like throughout your lifetime to end up at multiple plantations?
Oh yeah.
Or would they have been at like the same one?
Oh yeah, you would be sold multiple times. Traditionally, a lot of kids would be sold at birth, and they would be moved somewhere else. Then as they start to get 5 and 6 years old, they get sold again. And then when you're a teenager, you get sold again, depending on what that plantation needs. So for example, girls between the ages of 5 and 10 are traditionally used for housework. So you would be sold to somebody who needs a house. So what if your plantation owner gets old and doesn't have kids anymore and doesn't need you to take care of the house anymore? So you sell them again, or you will trade them for another one. And so a lot of times what happens is that most of your slave homes, or like your slave, I shouldn't even call them homes, but basically the place where they stayed, is that they would be several different families with oftentimes none of them being related to each other. And if you were related, they would put you in separate housing so that you couldn't communicate, because they thought if you were together that you would possibly plan a rebellion or something along those lines. So yeah.
So would they like raise the slaves until they were like 5 when they could start working, or?
Yeah, so when you say raise the slaves, what would basically happen is that you would be told that your job is to raise the children. Oftentimes what would happen, if you guys have ever heard of a wet nurse before? So a wet nurse is basically, it used to be a profession until today when we have like a lot more modern technology and formula, but there used to be no formula. And as a slave, you wouldn't be fed a lot of food, and you need that to be able to nurse a baby. So what would happen is, and this happened also back in Europe and things like that, is you would have a wet nurse. And the wet nurse, which is usually for the wealthy, would be somebody who was designated as nursing the children. And they would be fed and watered and things like that and given the proper nutrition needed. And that was their only job, was to nurse. Because basically what happens is that you will continue to nurse until there's nobody to nurse on you. So you can have multiple kids and you will just nurse your entire life, and that's your job. So a lot of like royals in England, for example, that's all you would do, is you would nurse the royal babies, and that's all you would do for your entire life, and that was your income. And so what would happen is oftentimes a lot of the slave areas would have a wet nurse, and their job specifically for 5, 6, 7 slaves was to nurse the kids and raise them until they're able to be sold, which then they would be sold out. So if you, for example, bought the baby from the mom, that's fine, because you just give the baby to the wet nurse, and the wet nurse raises that kid to be able to grow up. And male slaves are obviously a lot more in demand than female slaves. So often, there was also infanticide, where they would, kill the babies that they didn't want to be able to have, and instead go to be able to get the older ones. But females were also really light, because they could again be used to sexual assault, so you can be able to get more kids, and then also as housework as well. So it's a really awful, awful thing that happened at this time period, as you can tell. Now, also in Richmond, Virginia, it's also really interesting because this was also the headquarters of the Confederacy during the Civil War. To give you some perspective, Richmond, Virginia is about an hour and a half away from Washington, D.C. So the two headquarters of the two Confederacy and the Union were only an hour and a half. So I've been to the Confederacy of the White House. These are all my pictures that I took. And this was one of the weirdest places I've ever been. The reason it's so weird is it's funded by what are called the Daughters of Jefferson Davis, who are basically the descendants of the President of the Confederacy. So they fund this, and they've tried to get like field trips to come, but a lot of the districts have banned field trips to be able to go to this location. When we went, they made it really abundantly clear that the Union was the one at fault, and that the Confederacy should have won and things like that. It's a really weird environment to go to. And when we went, it was like a Tuesday afternoon, and there were protesters, and they told us there's protesters every single day outside of it, because they don't want this to still exist. They want to tear it down. So it's really kind of an interesting, weird thing in Richmond, Virginia. But that brings us to the flying squirrels. You might say, what does flying squirrels have anything to do with APUSH? Well, what happened is the flying squirrels were their minor league baseball team, kind of like how we have the bees here. And they were a pretty big deal. And so they were like, we want to make a cool new stadium. And we're going to make this awesome new stadium in Richmond, Virginia for our flying squirrels team. That's great. Well, one of the things is that the original plot of where they were going to put the stadium was right along the interstate. That's awesome, right? Get off the interstate, go to your major league or minor league baseball game, and you can leave. The problem is that when they went to go build this stadium, and they were digging right along the interstate, so it's shocking that they didn't discover this when they did the interstate. But when they were digging, they discovered the largest slave auction site in Richmond, Virginia, and therefore the United States, underneath the inner pass of the interstate. They had never dug it up. They never realized it. At some point, they paved over it. One other interesting thing, too, is that all of the toxins in the salt from the seawater, from when they would come over and they would do the slave auctions, had gotten into the soil, so it perfectly preserved everything underneath. So even though it had dirt on it and had cement on it, all of this was exactly intact, and they were able to know exactly where everything is. So this is a location that's known as Lumpkin Slave Jail. And Lumpkin Slave Jail became the major auction site in Richmond, Virginia that people would go to. In fact, they called it the Devil's Half Acre because it was only half an acre large, and yet it had so much impact on the area of Richmond where people would be auctioned off. Now, another thing that this was really unique for is this was also a great way to punish your slaves. So what they would do is if you had a problem slave, they would pay for you to go to Lumpkin slave jail. Outside of the slave jail, they would have basically a public flogging area. So they would hang you up for 3 to 7 days without food, and they would hit you as the slaves would come in, and they would see you. Why would they do that so publicly?
Scare them.
To scare you, right? If you come in and you misbehave, you're going to be just like this person. And a lot of people died as well. A lot of people, they would flog them, and there was some primary sources we read that said they were flogging somebody they didn't realize was dead. And they had been dead for 3-4 days, and they just kept flogging them and didn't even realize they were dead until they began to stink and began to puff up. Because that was what the point of it was. So, interesting fact, though, about Lumpkin Slave Jail. Following the Civil War, obviously it can't be a slave jail anymore. It was purchased by a church and converted into a church. So the former major slave auction site actually became a church. Imagine sitting in your pew, and that's what you were singing, but it was right underneath. It actually became a major black church community as well. And they actually called it, they said, so this was by the priest that owned it. He said the old slave pen was no longer the devil's half acre, but God's half acre. And the idea was that it was converting to something that was better. The most famous slave to ever come through Lumpkin Slave Jail to be sold is a guy named Anthony Burns. Anthony Burns was a slave who escaped to the north and lived there for several years. He was really, really famous. He actually became, he didn't hide a secret that he was a runaway slave. He lived up there. He became very prominent in the community. People watched him all the time. Nobody arrested him because it was the north. We'll talk about this later, but there was this act called the Fugitive Slave Act, which made it legal in the 1850s to go and catch runaway slaves, and he was recaptured and resent back to his original plantation in the South. He becomes a really famous example of why this act, and we'll talk about the act later when we get to the Civil War, wasn't very successful. Now, if you go there today, this is what it looks like today. So it's not as ceremonial as it was previously. They basically got all the relics out, and then they preserved it with like casts. So they have like cement casts and things like that of all the different things, and then they covered it up, and you can go visit it, and this is it. So this is the interstate right here. And then they ended up moving the site because they couldn't disturb this site, and so they moved the stadium completely to someplace else. But I also want to point out something else interesting, and that's this little area right here. So this is actually like a walkway over the top, and it's a walkway underneath, and it has this giant field underneath. So this is Lumpkin Slave Jail right here, and then the stadium is way over here. They moved it pretty significantly. But what happened is that they decided, well, we're going to make this a really nice area in memorial of the enslaved peoples who were in Richmond. So they decided they were going to create this into like a nice park area because it couldn't be for the stadium anymore. So they were going to convert it into a park. So they go to convert it into a park, and they start digging, and guess what they discover? They discover a mass grave of 20,000 to 30,000 slaves in this area. So this is called the Old Negro Burial Ground. I just want to emphasize, we're going to start to see this word Negro come into our primary sources. We use this word historically, but it's not an appropriate term to refer to somebody who's black. Okay, it's actually extremely offensive. So I'll use this term historically, but just know that it's not a term I'm going to go to describe somebody who's black. So what happens is that this old Negro burial ground, it gets discovered, and it's thousands and thousands of people. And you might say, well, why was there one single mass grave for thousands of people? Well, what happened is that there was this guy named Gabriel Prosser, and he was a slave. He decided to do one of the largest slave rebellions in the entire history of the United States. What happened is that they failed. And we'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about slave rebellions, but it failed. They were captured. They set up a gallows on this burial ground. They hung them and then immediately threw them off to the side and created a mass grave. Imagine, for example, that you are about to be hung and you're seeing mass amounts of people being thrown into this grave. There were also people who were sent to Lumpkin Slave Jail, so we don't know how old a lot of these are. What we do know is that they took all of the people that were in this mass grave, they put them in a new location. It's not told where this new location is because they're trying to keep it private because they don't want people to desecrate the graves. They then created this massive park, which is what you're seeing today. So this is a picture that I took. You can see the interstate that's right here. So it's just this giant area, and it's supposed to be a reflection. So it has all these signs that basically say, like, see, contemplation and reflection, do not use this for recreational sports. But then when I went, there was like massive soccer games on top of it. And there were people like taking naps and stuff like that and playing frisbee, and the dogs were pooping everywhere. And it was really weird because the signs are small, but I do wonder if people realize in today's, because this was discovered about 15 years ago. I wonder if today people actually realize it or if they're just going to go there. So interesting fact about that. Now, if you're interested, by the way, of a way that Richmond has tried to, so you can see Richmond has a really bad history, right? And they're trying to reconcile and make it better with the world. So you guys know like the Confederate monuments, how they're trying to take them away? Richmond has a different idea. In Richmond, instead of taking away the Confederate monuments, they are adding new monuments. So this is the new monument that they have. This is called the Reconciliation Statue. So basically what this is, you can see it's two people hugging, and it says Reconciliation Triangle at the bottom. It has all this that's on there as well. But here's what makes this statue so cool. This is one of 3 statues. Anybody have any guesses based on the idea of Reconciliation Triangle where the other 2 statues might be? Africa and England. So what happens is they have the exact same ones in the areas of the triangular trade. So you have Liverpool, England, that ran the triangular trade, Benin, West Africa, where most of our slaves came from, and then Richmond, Virginia, where most of them came into port. So basically the idea is that they're coming back together in all the other countries. So like, for example, in West Africa, this was extremely applauded for having this, and they have one in each of those areas attempting to be able to kind of make amends. If you want a local relation to the Reconciliation Statue, we have actually here in Utah an interesting thing to have to do with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If you don't know, those were the atomic bombs dropped in World War II. A lot of people don't know that Tooele is where they practiced dropping the bombs. So the entire thing of the Enola Gay, which is who dropped those bombs, they came to Tooele, they practiced dropping the bombs all across the salt flats. And because of that, we're kind of connected to this atomic bomb history. There was a girl in Japan about, 10 years ago who wanted to kind of bring back the countries together. And so what she did is she made 1,000 paper cranes. And then she named each location that she felt had a connection to the atomic bomb. And she sent the crane to Tooele. And Tooele has it in there. I think it's in their city hall. And it's supposed to be the same idea here of reconciliation of all these countries coming back together and acknowledging what had happened. So there's your local connection. I don't know if they have it public or not, that crane. But we got it, I think, 3 years ago. Yeah.
The building in the back of the Africa and Virginia one is the same.
Well, I can tell you that these are, so I know for a fact that they're different. They might look really similar, but they are different. Because if you Google it, you can see that this one is in that separate one. They might just look really similar. And I do agree, they do look super similar. But this is the one that I directly pulled off of the African webpage. They have like a webpage for it. I never noticed that before, but you are totally right. They are super similar.
Exactly the same.
Okay, so in general, with the life of the slave, we're going to talk about this more extensively later, so I'm going to skip it for right now because we're going to talk about it significantly later. If you will go ahead and take this whole packet and flip it to the very back. So we talked about in the past the positives, negatives, I'm not going to cover those, but I do want you to bracket where it says continuities and changes. So if you will bracket from the what stayed the same down to what changed and star it. Our next essay type that we are going to talk about in this class is what's called a change of continuity essay. It's called a CCOT. So we're looking to what changed in the time period and what stayed the same in the time period. So here's all the things that continued throughout the time period. So women are still in that cult of domesticity. We've talked about that before. This idea of the pink jobs is something that we didn't necessarily discuss, but it makes a little bit of sense. So for example, the Lowell system, women worked in textiles. They worked in clothing. That was something that was common and expected of that time period. In today's world, we still have jobs that we personally stereotypically label as pink. If you guys have ever heard of that, there's that riddle, for example. It goes something along the lines of a dad is playing with his son and his son gets hurt. They bring him into surgery and the doctor says, wait, I can't operate on this kid because he's my son. Have you guys heard of that one before? And they're like, how could that be? And everyone's like, I don't know how it could be that. How could that work if the dad and it's because who's the surgeon? The mom, okay? And that's the whole idea of the riddle. That's because when we traditionally think of doctors, the first gender that comes to your head traditionally is male. Another thing, for example, teachers. Most teachers are assumed to be female teachers. 80% of the workforce for teachers are females. When you think of a nurse, what is the stereotype that media tells you that a nurse should be? Female. Now, is that true? No, but a great example is engineers. What do most people expect engineers to be? Male. And that's part of the reason why if you go on TikTok, I don't know how, but somehow I got an engineer TikTok. I don't know how that happened. But there's a lot of females. There was a huge trend about 2 weeks ago of girls talking about themselves being engineers in what would be considered a blue job workforce, where they assume that they're going to be male. It's really interesting to look at. So we're trying to move away, especially with a lot of our social justice movements, away from the pink roles, especially because there's so many ad campaigns like Females in STEM is a huge ad campaign to move away from this pink role job. Women are still seen as less than men. We're still dependent on agriculture, we talked about before. The South continues to make the raw goods and the North produces them. And then you have the changes, which again, there's a lot of stuff that changed, and especially that's what we tend to focus on the most. So the major changes is like our choice begins to increase. We move from a barter to a market economy, a merchant economy. Massive advances in technology, women in the workforce, pollution, deforestation, black belt, which we talked about before, and the movement from the cottage industry to factory goods. And again, if you will just star number 10, and the reason why is because this is one that's on AP Classroom. Your textbook likes to do immigration in the next unit and not this unit. So you will see immigration on the next unit, but that's because of your textbook, but it's technically in this unit in AP Classroom. But basically what we're trying to show is that people begin to move towards large cities where there's factories, and especially international migrants. Okay, so we are going to, so now you need to have 2 notes out. So we don't need those notes anymore. So you can put those notes away. We have about 10 minutes to get through just a short amount of notes, which is fine. So you still need your alligator notes. So you still need alligator notes for a quick second. Okay, so basically your next set of notes is going to be America through the end of most of period 4, excluding the Mexican-American War. That's what these notes are going to be about. So we basically are following the War of 1812. So following the War of 1812, you're going to notice that there is a massive new sense of, if you will star this first bullet, nationalism. This is supposed to say identity, not identify, so that's my bad. It's supposed to say identity and not identify. A common national culture and general community pride. So this basically, if you think of America on the 4th of July, this is America on the 4th of July. Massive national pride, massive culture, and national common unity. We also start to want to have worldwide power. So if you will also highlight worldwide power, and especially over what is known as the Western Hemisphere. So that's the overall goal. Now, America does have a lot of autonomy, but also tends to focus on things that had happened previously. So, for example, there was a lot of people who still related to England. A lot of America's trade came from England. A lot of imports came from England. A lot of people wore English clothing. So while they're more autonomous, there is still that connections to England even as they go along. Now this is actually on alligator notes. So if you will have your alligator notes, you need to flip to the back of alligator notes at the very bottom. It's the only thing you have not highlighted on alligator notes. Let's get flipping to alligator notes. Very bottom. All right, so this was just something that we didn't have time to cover with because Shark Tank kind of made it so we had to stop our lecture, which is fine. But these are a couple of things that we missed on alligator notes. So what happens is that America begins to expand into Florida and Oregon, okay? Now we're going to talk about Oregon a little bit later, but we're going to mostly focus on Florida right now. Now Florida was originally owned by Spain, so if you will highlight Spain, this is often used as a sourcing when they talk about Spain selling something to us. And you're going to see it with Florida. Now, Spain we had a problem with. Most of the Western or Eastern United States was owned by America, and then you had random Spain. We were worried about the trade in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as in general the threat to the American economy. Additionally, there was a whole bunch of settlers in America that were illegally immigrating to Florida. And they wanted it because Spain was extremely harsh on the Native Americans. Spain became far more concerned about California than keeping Florida. So what they do is they have what's called the Adams-Onis Treaty, which if you go ahead and highlight that, that's John Adams, by the way, or John Quincy Adams. They sell this treaty, which basically allows it to acquire Florida. And we also share a claim to Oregon. And we'll talk about acquiring Oregon later, but mostly you need to know about this is with Florida. So just know that the Adams-Onis Treaty acquires Florida. Now at the same time, another major document, and this is a 3-star term, it's very important. It's actually used a lot of times today in pop culture, as well as with people who are referring to what America has done in the past, is what is called the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine was a document that we created that banned European colonization. If you will start that first bullet. And basically America in this agreement recognizes multiple Latin American countries and says that they are officially independent from Spain. And in return, we agree that the Western Hemisphere is closed to everybody in Europe. So basically, we draw a line. So if you look at Mega Map over here, we basically draw a line right down the Atlantic Ocean, and we say everything to this side is no longer part of Europe. This is all our own, and you can't do anything about it. We also say in that same treaty that while Europe is cut off, guess who isn't cut off from America and South America and Central America? The United States. So while Europe is cut off, America can still do this. And that's what this Monroe Doctrine is. It cuts off all of Europe. Now we're going to talk about later, as in significantly later, as in January, about the effect of this Monroe Doctrine. A lot of people comment and they say, how is it that England would accept this if it's against England? A lot of this has to do with most European countries at this time are dealing with their own loss of colonies, and they're so sick of America and a lot of the rebellions happening throughout the Americas that they just say, go ahead and have it. Now later this comes into conflict, but a lot of this had to do with the fact that they didn't want to be in continual wars with the United States. Now we also had, so this is going back to your other notes, so now we're done with those notes. So Allegheny notes are done. And now we're back to the new notes. Now we did have a really interesting Supreme Court case that happened during this time period. It's called McCulloch v. Maryland. It came up on the AP Gov test, I think it was 2 years ago, and sometimes you'll have it here too. If you want to go ahead and star the second bullet, and you can put underneath it what is called the Supremacy Clause. That is SUPREMACY, then space clause. What happened is that basically these were two companies that were shipping companies. One was in New Jersey, and one was in New York. And what happened is that one of these companies said that they controlled the Erie Canal and in the Hudson River. In contrast, the other one said, no, we get to control it. And one of them got a contract with New York, and New York said, that's it, it's closed now. Well, what happened is it goes up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically determines that the federal government is higher than the state government. That's what's called the Supremacy Clause. That's why if we have a law that's established in the Supreme Court, a state government can't just say, well, we want to ignore that. Oops. Yeah, and we talked about that before. If you also want to put down Ogden v. Gibbons, and I just barely realized I totally flipped this, so this is totally my fault. So the Supremacy Clause is established actually by, this was my fault, Ogden v. Gibbons. I messed up. This was my fault. As well as McCulloch v. Maryland. So McCulloch v. Maryland had to do with the first bank in the United States, where basically what happened is the first bank in the United States gets outlawed and strucken down, and it's reignited by the federal government. And then Ogden v. Gibbons is that interstate commerce where it says that the federal government once again has higher rights. That was my fault. I apologize. Now at this time we also enter what is known as the era of good feelings. And the era of good feelings is exactly like it sounds like. What happens is this is the era of James Monroe's president, and it's exactly, if you want to put right above this, is the HC would be the War of 1812. So the War of 1812 ends, and America has tons of national pride. What also happens is that the Federalists are almost completely gone. Anybody remember why the Federalists died out? Literally? Hamilton dies. So if you want to put next to this one, Hamilton dies. So what political parties does that make James Monroe? Anti-Federalist, better known as a Democratic Republican at this time. So I put down Democratic Republican. And basically what happens is, if there's no two parties, it's a lack of excitement. So the era of good feelings is literally the 4 years, approximately, and then it later on extends to his second term, where there was pretty much no major partisans. So if you want to start this last bullet, this is when there was strong nationalism and economic growth, mostly due to the War of 1812. We expand westward, and few partisan conflicts because there's not two parties. All right, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to stop there. So you can go ahead and stop, put your stuff away, and I'm going to explain the assignment for homework.